Hello, good morning, and a warm welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay, in for your host, Ladia Kerdeluale. The headlines. Newborn killed in Russian strikes as maternity ward in southern Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin and Cuban counterpart Miguel Diaz-Canel pledged to deepen ties. Ukraine setting up Invincibility centers to help provide heat and water. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Ukrainian military officials say a newborn baby has been killed by Russian strikes on a maternity ward in Ukraine's southern Zaporizhzhia region overnight. Alexander Staruk, head of the Zaporizhzhia Regional Military Administration, says Russian forces had launched huge rockets at a small maternity ward in the hospital in the city. He also adds that rescue teams have responded to the site of the attack. Russian President Vladimir Putin and his Cuban counterpart have unveiled a monument in the North Moscow Square on Tuesday to Cuban revolutionary leader Fidel Castro, pledging to deepen their friendship in the face of U.S. sanctions against both countries. Castro, who took power in 1959, is not commemorated by statues in his homeland because his brother Raul said after his death in 2016 he wanted to avoid a personality cult. But Putin evoked his memory as he told Diaz-Canel the two countries needed to build on the solid foundation of friendship established between Castro and Soviet leaders. Russia, hit by Western sanctions over the conflict in Ukraine, is looking to strengthen political and economic ties with other countries opposed to what it calls U.S. hegemony. Cuba has been under huge U.S. economic embargo since the 1962 period after the communist revolution led by Fidel Castro. The Kremlin says that no substantive progress has been made toward creating a security zone around the Russian-controlled Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in southeastern Ukraine. Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which Russia seized shortly after its invasion, was rocked by shelling on Sunday, drawing condemnation from the UN nuclear watchdog, IAEA, which says such attacks risk a major disaster.
There has been no substantial progress in this regard. And besides, we should define what we mean by the security zone. You know that at the beginning of the conflict, Ukraine was calling on Russia to withdraw heavy weaponry that wasn't there. Then, apparently, everybody understood that there were no heavy Russian weapons there. So, speaking about the security zone, we should only be talking about those who are shelling the station. Who is this threat there? It's those people who are shelling the station who are creating the threat. The Ukrainian Armed Force Artillery. That's what we need to demand from Ukraine. To withdraw their heavy weaponry and stop shelling. To stop endangering the European continent.
Meanwhile, the Ukrainian prosecutor has launched an investigation after a video emerged on social media that Moscow says shows Russian soldiers killed after surrendering to Ukrainian forces last weekend. Ukraine's Human Rights Commissioner has claimed the Russians staged a surrender, that they staged it and opened fire first, adding that returning fire is not a war crime. However, the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told journalists that Russia will do everything possible to search for those responsible, adding that they must be punished. Meanwhile, Ukraine's prosecutor general has produced an explanation to the alleged execution of the unarmed Russian prisoners of war by Ukrainian servicemen. Now, according to Kiev, Russian soldiers committed perfidy and only imitated a surrender, and so their killing was justified. Ukrainian authorities have launched a probe into the alleged perfidy as they called it, which means to be deceitful. The prosecutor stated on Tuesday, blaming the gruesome incident solely on the deceased Russian soldiers. The prosecutor's statement reads, according to the results of mass media monitoring, it became known that in the village of Makivka, Luhansk region, the Russian military, imitating a surrender to the servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine, opened fire on Ukrainian defenders. Such actions are prohibited by international humanitarian law. Ukraine Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba says special attention shall be paid to sanctions that slow down and stop Russia's missile industry. Kuleba called for more sanctions and Russia's strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Russia's attacks on Ukrainian energy facilities follow a series of battlefield setbacks that have included a pullout of Russian forces from the southern city of Kherson to the east bank of the mighty Dnipro River that dissects the country. In the meantime, Ukraine's national power grid operator says the damage dealt to Ukrainian power generating facilities by Russian missile attacks was colossal, but dismissed the need to evacuate civilians. The chief executive officer of the power grid company told a briefing that Ukrainians could face long power outages, but that the grid operator wanted to help provide the conditions for people to remain in the country through winter. He adds that a short cold snap was expected from Wednesday, but that temperatures would rise again after that, providing an opportunity to stabilize the power generating system.
Practically no thermal or hydroelectric stations have been left unscathed. For you to understand the scale of those attacks and what we have to deal with, practically all thermal and hydro generations, meaning major power stations, have been damaged by missile attacks. We also don't have any unscathed key substations in Kherson. The scale of damage is colossal. After every widespread missile attack, we need some time to repower most energy consumers and renew the capability to provide them electricity through the grid. There are enough fuel reserves in the country. I can share Montenegro's experience as well. We accumulate sufficient fuel reserves, just like any critical infrastructure operator. We never had problems with acquiring fuel for autonomous power supplies.
President Volodymyr Zelensky says Ukrainians needing basic services if Russia knocks out power stations and other facilities this winter can turn into special invincibility centers. Thousands of centers spread across the country will offer electricity, heat, water, internet service, mobile phone connections, and a pharmacy free of charge and around the clock. Russian attacks have knocked out power for long periods, up to 10 million consumers at a time.
Russian strikes were to happen again. We continue to roll out our new project designed to support people. The Invincibility centers. The tally to this day is 4,000 such centers have been deployed. More on the way. If massive Russian strikes were to happen again, and if we would have the understanding that power would not be restored within a few hours, then the work of these invincibility centers will be activated. All the basic necessities will be provided. This is electricity, telephone services, internet, heating, water, first aid medicines. I'm grateful to all entrepreneurs who decided to help society now and are turning their business premises into invincibility centers. Concerning the energy front, power utilities and municipal workers continue repair works on the grid.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz says Germany will not become dependent on strategic resource like gas. Addressing the economic summit of Germany's daily Süddeutsche Zeitung, Scholz says, in his words, "My understanding from many discussions with German industry leaders is this mistakes won't happen a second time." He added that Germany had introduced economic diversification a long time ago. The German government will continue to accompany it politically. A survey by the UK Office for National Statistics has found that there's been a significant increase in the number of Ukrainians who've entered the UK under Ukraine humanitarian schemes in work compared to the number in June this year. UK Humanitarian Response Insight Survey collected responses from about 9,601 individuals in June 2022, the majority of which entered the UK under the Ukraine sponsorship scheme, and followed up with 3,148 of those individuals between October 17th and November the 7th. In the follow-up survey, 56% of adults reported working in the UK, up from 19% in June survey. There was also an increase in the number of respondents who say they could speak English fluently or a fair amount, from 44% in June survey to 57% in the follow-up. The percentage of those surveyed who say they had enough money to support themselves and their dependents for the next 3 months also increased from 37% to 60%. However, the results showed that half of the surveyed individuals reported difficulty taking up work in the UK, while 45% had experienced barriers to accessing private rented accommodation. Now let's talk to Mr. Chidi Wawunu, security expert, joining us virtually from London.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. Let's begin, if we can, with the alleged execution of the Russian soldiers by the Ukrainian soldiers. And now the Ukrainians have said that what they've called it perfidy, that they were deceitful in presenting themselves as having wanting to surrender, only to turn around and to attempt to attack the Ukrainians, to which they replied with firepower, and that ended up with a massacre, if you want to call it that. What is your reaction to these two views from both sides?
Well, I think the first thing is that it's important to state that any allegation of a war crime has to be investigated. So on face value, the Ukrainians are correct. The video that we've seen so far has been heavily edited, but it very clearly shows Ukrainian, Russian aligned prisoners being taken prisoner, and then another fellow coming out and opening fire on them. Now, this is a classic case of perfidy, as in pretending to surrender and then, you know, using that as a ruse to attack your captors. Whether those who were on the floor were participants in this perfidy or this alleged perfidy is contested, but it seems clear that there was grounds for the Ukrainians to return fire once that soldier had an open fire. There were no grounds necessarily to kill those on the floor, but if there was a crossfire and they got caught in the crossfire, which seems to have been what happened, then it would just be a really tragic mistake. And the only way forward, obviously, is an independent investigation, but it's unlikely to happen because both sides obviously have a message that they want to pass in this war. For the Russians, who have ignored the multiple allegations of their own war crimes, this is obviously a way for them to paint the Ukrainians as, you know, war criminals and as bad actors. And for the Ukrainians, they obviously want to make this go away, but also want to highlight the fact that the Russians were acting in bad faith. And this, again, feeds into the narrative of the Ukrainians that even if they negotiate with the Russians will act in bad faith in the same way that they acted in bad faith in this surrender.
And obviously, these are the reasons why war is such a horrible situation, and that's why they say make peace, not war. As far as the Putin-Castro connection is concerned, it seems as if Russia is going out of its way to be, as it were, the black sheep of the world, and there's a definite divide that's going on. The bigger picture of what's happening now with the alignment of Russia with its supporters, if you will, how do you think this should be perceived by the international community?
I don't think there's any change necessarily in Russia's behavior now. I think the world has more or less settled into its camps, as it were. What the Russians now more or less have no operational options left. If we break the kind of the campaign down into the strategic sense, the operational and the tactical, we can ignore the tactical. That's just people shelling each other and killing each other. But in the operational sense, the ability to mount offensives, to change the the nature of the battlefield, the Russians have more or less run out of options. They don't have the troop numbers, they don't have the command, they don't have the logistics. The Ukrainians have the initiative. Their morale is extremely high following their victories, and they are the underlining message for all the Ukrainian soldiers is quite clear: they're liberating their country. Meanwhile, the Russians are having a lot of problems in terms of their morale is very low. The soldiers have been defeated quite a bit. And even if you have the highest kind of motivation in the world, defeats will sap morale. They're also having problems with their mobilization. Lots of videos are coming out about poorly equipped troops and troops not getting training. And most importantly, this is a factor which maybe people seem to overlook. They seem to think, God, this is Russia, winter will be to their advantage. Winter is here. It's not even winter is coming, as in the Game of Thrones. Winter is here. And for those of us who served in Europe, winter is not a joke. Winter here is horrible, and if you're living outdoors, it is very, very, very miserable. You need to be very, very well equipped. You need the proper clothing, warm clothing, waterproof clothing. You need the ability to heat yourself. You're not going to get that in a trench. So it's going to be a very miserable winter for the Russians. They're going to be struggling just to keep the troops they have supplied and at least just on the defensive, much less on the offensive. So that leaves them the strategic sphere. This is the only space where they can actually make any movements. And this is what you see with the alignments with North Korea, with Iran, and now with Cuba. These are all things, the Cuba thing is maybe more just to annoy America or to try and maybe put a bit of pressure on America. It has no bearing on the conflict. But it's just more things that they have to throw into the mix to try and keep everyone off balance. You'll see a few more threats about nuclear weapons. You'll see some things about Zaporizhzhia nuclear plants. You'll see them accusing the Ukrainians of being Satanists and all of this stuff. It's just to try and keep the Ukrainians and their allies off balance while the Russians try and buy time to get their forces into a condition where they can go back on the offensive.
And speaking of the offensive, this, by all purposes, by all indications, has seemed to be a defensive war. Ukraine is not going to attack Russia in their own territory. They're defending themselves and pushing the Russians back. What is this doing for both parties returning to the negotiating table? It seems as though things are getting worse, if at all they will ever get better.
Well, this war, like almost every single war, will end with a negotiation, however much anybody wants to say otherwise. Every side knows this, and essentially all we're seeing now is the preparation for that negotiation and on what terms will that negotiation take place. Now, whether for the Russians that negotiation has to be that they manage to at least keep Crimea and parts of Donbass. For the Ukrainians, it's going to be they get everything. And somewhere there has to be a compromise. But the most important factor is that neither side is going to sit down and negotiate unless they have an advantage in the battlefield or they see that they have no way of winning on the battlefield. For the Ukrainians, that's very simple. They just need to keep attacking, pushing the Russians out of their territory. For the Russians, they need to defend. Now, the biggest problem, defend it and then possibly go back and take the lands that they've now claimed is theirs. Now, the biggest problem that the Ukrainians have is that whilst victory might be in their sights right now, in that they might be able to defeat the Russians, they will obviously continue fighting over winter, fight through the spring, and then hopefully fight through the summer if they've got the manpower for it. Even if they sit down and negotiate with the Russians, it's how they then guarantee that the Russians will not just go away, regroup, and come back in a few years. So this is the big dilemma. This is the issue that maybe the Ukrainians have to worry about. And this is why you'll see a very maximalist approach for the Ukrainians, in that they're insisting they will not negotiate away Crimea or Donbass. They have to go in a maximalist way so that when they do sit down with the Russians, they make sure there's a limited amount of concessions that they give. It's going to be a horrible negotiation because at the first stage of this negotiation will be on the battlefield, and essentially a lot of young men are going to die for something that could have been agreed now, to be honest.
How much of a role will dissent in the Kremlin, if there is any at all, that is not being crushed, or in Moscow, in Russia generally, have to play in ending this war? Because when they call it Putin's war, it also means that there are people in Russia who do not support this special military operation, as he calls it. Do you think there is any chance of any opposition from within Moscow to this war that will put any leverage against Putin?
Yes, so you can see that right now there were movements in Russia that are having an influence on Putin. However, they're not movements that, depending if you're on thinking from the Ukrainian point of view, that are necessarily that favorable to Ukraine. So there were several factors that weigh in on Putin. The first is his own clique, as it were, the Slivoviki, and the nationalist kind of movement that surrounds it. They have been the biggest opponents, not necessarily of the war, but of the conduct of the war. And that's the constituency that he's most afraid of. These are people who speak, to use a Nigerian phrase, in the language that he understands. And some of them have control of their own security forces, from Pizogin to Kadyrov and all of these kind of people. Now, if they turn against Putin, if these people who have the power, military combat power, as well as, the financial power and the networks turn against Putin, then he's in trouble. It doesn't necessarily mean the end of the war. It just means the end of Putin as a leader. He'll either step down, go on a holiday, fall sick, fall out of a window, whatever it is. We'll see the end of Putin. Not necessarily the end of the war. The other factor is obviously the Russian people themselves. Now, they are a factor, but not so much of a factor. This is why you see Putin declaring a partial mobilization and then recruiting everybody, because he still has to make sure that he doesn't get the situation that happened in the Afghan war of the 1980s, which is what is happening now, where you get the mothers and the wives of soldiers now going to look for their sons, and what happened in Chechnya as well, going to look for their sons, going to look for their husbands, and raising social tension. So you're getting that now, people complaining about the mobilization. It's not organized. It's not enough that people are going to get on the streets. The kind of people who would have got on the streets have already left the country. So he can kind of keep that quiet for as long as he can. But once the people in power feel this man is getting us into trouble, we're not going to win, they will most likely get rid of him. Whether they choose to end the war is one question, or whether they choose to escalate the war is another. But to be brutally honest, it's a kind of a situation that's so much flux that you can't say whether one side is good or one side is not. It's something one has to monitor.
In other words, you're like caught between a rock and a hard place. Thank you
Indeed.
so much. Thank you so much for your perspective, Mr. Chidi Iwanu, the security expert speaking to us out of London.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're watching the special coverage of Russian invasion. Coming up, World Bank gives $4.5 billion in new assistance to Ukraine as EU pledges $2.5 billion. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Russian energy giant Gazprom says it will reduce natural gas supply to Europe as of next Monday by pinching flow to a pipeline that runs through Ukraine. On its official Telegram account, state-owned company said gas meant for Moldova is being held in Ukraine, so it will reduce supply to the Sudza pipeline to account for the difference. The energy company says the volume of gas supplied by Gazprom to the GIS Sudza for transit to Moldova through the territory of Ukraine exceeds the physical volume transmitted at the border of Ukraine with Moldova. Europe has raced to replenish its stocks this year ahead of winter as Russia dramatically cut its flows of pipeline gas, including halting all shipments through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline in September. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has announced that the European Union will provide another 2.5 billion euros in financial aid for Ukraine. She says the EU Commission is planning to aid Ukraine with a support package of 18 billion euros in 2023, with funding dispersed regularly for urgent repairs and recovery. She wrote on her social media, "We will keep on supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes." Ukraine's Prime Minister thanked the EU for the assistance, describing the move as another step of solidarity. Joining us now is David Awurawo, Professor David Awurawo, Head of Department of History and Strategic Studies, University of Lagos. Thank you so much for coming on our special coverage of Russian invasion.
Thank you for having me on the program.
maybe you can give us some historical context as to the open show of support, which has obviously been Russian policy, but this time dedicating a monument to Fidel Castro in Moscow alongside his Cuban counterpart. What are your thoughts of what Putin is doing? It seems as though he's going out of his way to be, as it were, the black sheep of the modern world.
Well, not exactly so. The modern world doesn't have to be Western world. Countries have always been split along ideological lines. And over the years, since the end of World War II, we have had countries that adopted the socialist ideology. Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, and now Russia. Cuba also belonged to that camp. China was in that camp, and the Eastern European countries of the then Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and the rest of them also belong to that camp.
Okay, so now what do you make of the current situation of things as far as Russia is concerned and its position is taking with Ukraine? It seems as though it's not ready to in any way negotiate, and even the withdrawal from Kherson is only to regroup to attack again. What do you make of Russia's body language as far as coming back to the negotiating table is concerned?
Well, the war will likely go on for quite some time. We have said that several times, before now. Russia is not likely going to go away very quickly, very soon, and accept defeat in Ukraine. So the war will likely go on for quite some time. But both sides, I'm sure now, both sides recognize the fact that they will not likely be able to win the war outrightly. So the earlier they realize that and come to the negotiating table, the better for them and the better for the international community. Because, as you have seen, the war has caused a whole lot of destabilization of the international system, has caused, food insecurity in many parts of the world. And of course, we can see the devastation that has taken place in Ukraine especially. You mentioned a while ago about, how much assistance the EU has further added to what it has done to aid Ukraine. All of that is a waste, in a sense, really. And so Russia at some point will come to the negotiating table and they will reach some agreement and end the war. But I'm not sure it's something that will happen anytime soon. So the prediction is that things will likely get worse before they begin to get better.
The reason why I bring this up again is because look at the hardline countries who are hardline against Russia, and countries like France with Emmanuel Macron, who are speaking of being more diplomatic as far as resolving this issue is concerned. Australia, who don't want to hear anything from Putin but him withdrawing his forces. How Israel, who also are being more delicate as far as opposing Putin is concerned. How important is it for the international community to bring their influence to bear on Putin in ways that will not be seen to be supporting Russian aggression?
In reality, the countries that have a leverage at this point are countries like China that Russia respects and that Russia trusts. Western countries are not likely countries that will do much in trying to resolve this conflict. Countries like China,
Turkey, how about Turkey?
That have supported
Turkey?
Yes, countries like China are the countries that have, a leverage on this matter. And not Western countries like France tried at the beginning of the war, but increasingly France has given support to Ukraine, and that clout it had when the war started is no longer there as such. So it's actually countries like China that can, influence Russia. When Russia sees that countries like China are, more desirous of the war coming to an end and diplomacy taking place, that is what will have, impact that is significant on Russia's decision and Russia's position on the war. Countries like France, the United Kingdom, all those countries of the West, they are countries that Russia has perceived as being in the war itself. So they are not likely countries that, will do much in trying to bring the war to an end. Of course, they can continue to do what they can. But it's countries like Russia that have the power and that, Russia respects and that Russia sees as an ally in the war. When countries like that begin to speak very strongly about the need to bring the war to an end, those are the things that will help, to bring the war to an end as quickly as possible. But like I said, Russia is not likely going to just accept defeat and leave Ukraine. So the war will likely still go on for quite some time before, diplomatic engagement will help to bring it to an end.
Obviously, technology and progress has made the world a global village. But as far as Africa is concerned and where we are, and with your expertise on issues such as this, many will question if any African country has any kind of leverage they can bring to bear against Russia or even to support Ukraine. What are your thoughts of the position of Africa on the Ukraine-Russia war?
Well, yeah, like you said, the world is a global village. Everyone has something to contribute to bringing the war to an end. There are countries like South Africa that haven't taken a definitive position to support Ukraine like other countries that Nigeria has. Most African countries have this foreign policy objective, this strand in their foreign policy. That is promotion of global peace and security. And Russia is perceived as the aggressor in this war. And Russia is seen as a country that invaded Ukraine. So that has made a whole lot of African countries to support Ukraine, if you like, in the war. To say that Russia has carried out aggression, Russia must withdraw from Ukraine. But there are a few countries like South Africa, for instance, that have said, no, they want to be neutral in this matter. Countries like that have the capacity to influence, Russia by making the Russians know that, look, the war is destabilizing the global community, and there is a need to, bring the war to an end, to negotiate and bring it to an end so that global stability can be achieved. So Africa has something to add, not something so significant because of the low level of influence on the global scene, but Africa does have something to add, to bring the war to a conclusion.
What about Nigeria? What about Nigeria, Professor? Okay, we do apologize. We'll leave it there, and we thank the good professor, for his time. Okay, I do believe you're back with us. Professor, I was asking, what about Nigeria?
Well, Nigeria has already taken a position. The United Nations engagement on the matter, discussion on the matter,
we do sincerely apologize for the technical glitch. But we thank Professor David Awarawa, the professor and head of Department of History and Strategic Studies, University of Lagos, for being on the program, possibly if we may go back to him. But in the meantime, we will continue with the program and turn our attention to more spokesperson for the Ukraine Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Oleg Nikolenko, says experts from Iran and Ukraine have met to discuss allegations about the use of Iranian-made attack drones in Russia's war on Ukraine. The spokesperson says, quote, such an expert meeting did take place. I cannot disclose the details, but I can assure you that the Ukrainian side continues to take the most dramatic, or rather drastic measures to prevent the use of Iranian weapons by Russia for the war against Ukraine. He adds that Ukraine has informed Iran that the consequences of complicity in the Russian aggression will be incommensurable with the potential benefits of cooperation with Russia. U.S. officials have said that Russia has received hundreds of drones from Tehran, which have been used to deadly effect. More support pouring for Ukraine now. This time, the World Bank says it will give about $4.5 billion in additional aid to Ukraine. The World Bank says in a statement that the aid will help to sustain essential services and core government functions at the national and regional levels while fending off Russian forces. The statement adds that the money provided by the U.S. will help pay wages for hospital workers, government and school employees, pensions for the elderly, salaries for public servants, and social programs for the vulnerable. U.S. Agency for International Development said in a statement on Tuesday that robust safeguards put in place by the World Bank, coupled with USAID-funded expert third-party monitoring support embedded within the Ukrainian government, ensures accountability and transparency in the use of these funds. It went along to say that Kyiv will receive the funding in 2 tranches before the end of 2022. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development says global economy should avoid a recession next year, but the worst energy crisis since the 1970s will trigger a sharp slowdown, with Europe hit hardest. The OECD urges central banks to keep hiking interest rates. World economic growth is set to slow from 3.1% this year up to 2.2% next year, before accelerating to 2.7% in 2024, marginally raising its 2022 forecast. OECD says the global slowdown was hitting economies unevenly, with energy Europe bearing the brunt as Russia's war in Ukraine both hits business activity and drives an energy price spike.
It is sadly a statement of the obvious that the global economy continues to face significant challenges. Russia's unprovoked, unjustifiable and illegal war of aggression continues to rage. Global growth is slowing down, continues to slow down, and confidence has weakened. Inflation has become broad-based and persistent, and in response, central banks have been raising policy rates and global financial conditions have tightened significantly. Consequently, the economic outlook that Alvaro and I are presenting today is fairly downbeat. We project global GDP to slow from 3.1% in 2022 to 2.2% in 2023. That is GDP growth well below the rate foreseen prior to the start of the war.
When we return, Greater Hungary, Viktor Orban, Greater Hungary scarf, including part of Ukraine, as Hungary angers Romania and Ukraine. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to our special coverage of Russian invasion. Now we will turn our attention to the business side of things, and Laddie Williams is with us this morning. Laddie, good morning to you. Good morning. Now, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development says there will be growth, but it will be less than what was previously projected.
Right.
3.1% down from 5.9%.
Yeah, and it's no different from what other projections we've gotten from the IMF and the World Bank, because at the end of the day, we're seeing global central bankers trying to battle inflation at this time, trying to, rein it in, because that's been the big issue, globally now, inflation, and trying to bring it down. And we've seen that happen because of rising energy prices and, rising food prices. Most of them, see it as blame it on the war in Ukraine, because we've seen how that has, driven up the prices of energy, oil, gas, and all of that. So all of that playing into, rising inflation globally. We're seeing that, the central bankers are battling inflation at the risk of slowing growth. We're seeing recession fears, in the US, the UK, the Bank of England has already predicted that the UK, their GDP is they're going to go into the deepest recession in history, talking about the UK. So all of this, the projection is quite, gloomy, and it is expected, as long as this war continues, energy prices are going to stay elevated.
I mean, there's no other elephant in the room.
Right.
So for the EU, who are planning emergency break price cap on natural gas, what's that about?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, it's still this issue with rising energy costs. So we're seeing Europe now trying to get this proposal out there to put a cap, on electricity prices in Europe, put it about 270 euros per kilowatt hour, and that's coming from about 170. So current prices are still, lower than the cap they're projecting. But at the end of the day, they're trying to see how, they can protect, manufacturing companies and households, because at the end of the day, they've been able to, get their storage, up to par this year. But there are still fears that come next year, they would have to, secure their storage without any supply from Russia. So they're preparing for that and seeing how they can cap prices so that prices don't go over the roof.
Okay, the CBN MPC rates raises MPR rates to 16.5%?
Yeah, yesterday that was it was 100 basis points. Not as big as the last raise. That was about 150 basis points, because the CBN was quite impressed, seeing that inflation tapered on a month-on-month basis. So there's a deceleration. So that's why they didn't go, as heavy as they did the last time. It's a good sign, but at the end of the day, inflation is still elevated, and the central bank and the MPC are trying to see how they can still continue, that trend in deceleration, on a month-to-month, because on a year-on-year, it's still, quite high at 21.09%. So it's still that big battle, that most central bankers are having at this time, against inflation. But it's the last meeting for the year. It's, a sense of things to come, for 2023. Looks like we're going into next year with more, rate hikes with the way it's looking, seeing what's happening with the U.S. Fed and all of that.
Exactly. And if you're wondering, what has that got to do with the war in Ukraine?
Yes. Same old. Rising energy prices, rising food prices.
How are the markets looking?
The market's not looking bad, but in the U.S., we're seeing, the market's actually closing the green. Europe is in the green right now, but investors are looking out for the Fed minutes, coming out today to see signs of whether the Fed are going to go with another jumbo hike at their next meeting. So that's what everyone is looking at right now.
Is there anything that the end of the year is bringing to the table as far as the festivities is concerned that can or is affecting any of these markets?
Well, at the end of the day, at festivity periods, it's still, we're still looking out for demand, what demand is going to look like, even though incomes are squeezed. But, regardless, when it's festivities, people will still spend. And that is, somehow going to stoke, inflation with big demand. So everyone is looking out for how to tame inflation, even though festivities are coming.
Thank you so much, Laddie. Catch Laddie again at the top of the next hour on Business Morning.
Exactly. Thank you.
Just over 1 week after being retaken by Ukrainian forces, the city of Kherson has begun to replace many Russian propaganda billboards left by its former occupiers. Kherson was occupied by Russian forces for nearly 9 months, during which the city was formally annexed by Moscow. Although the Russians retreated to the east side of the Dnieper River, the city's landscape is still dotted with dozens of pro-Russian propaganda posters and even billboards. While many of them expound the benefits of receiving a Russian passport, others advise locals to sign up for the Russian pension system or vote yes to be annexed by Putin's administration. According to an official at the local Ukrainian government communication department, Kherson began tearing down the Russian billboards and replacing them with their own posters promoting the Ukrainian armed forces. Finally, the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry says Ukraine will summon the Hungarian ambassador to protest that the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban went to a football match wearing a scarf depicting some Ukrainian territory as part of Hungary. Ukrainian media showed images of Orban meeting a Hungarian footballer on Sunday wearing a scarf, which the outlets of Ukrainian Pravda said depicted a map of Greater Hungary, including territory that is now part of the neighboring states of Austria, Slovakia, Romania, Croatia, Serbia, and Ukraine. Ukrainian ministry spokesperson Oleg Nikolenko says Ukraine wanted an apology and a rebuttal of any Hungarian claims to Ukrainian territory. In a Facebook post on Tuesday, Mr. Orban did not directly address the controversy over the scarf. The two countries have repeatedly clashed in recent years over what Hungary said were curbs on the right of ethnic Hungarians living in Ukraine to use their native tongue, especially in education, after Ukraine passed a law in 2017 restricting the use of minority languages in schools.
Nekem van egy cipőm, amelyik a 100. válogatottságon. Igen. Fenn van a szekrényemben. Ott dörzsös. Gratulálok, Balázs. Óriási.
Talán, hogy győzelemmel sikerült. Fontos volt.
And that's our special coverage on Russian invasion. Thanks for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay in for Ladia Keduluale. Do have a great Wednesday. See you again.